It had to have been sometime around evening when the power flickered off briefly. But it could have been much longer than that, as no light passed through the cracks in the wooden slats and debris we'd covered the windows with. That green digital clock over the oven was a godsend in those brain-melting, meaningless hours. My wife held onto the shotgun so that if any one of those tendrils decided to spring through the fortifications, she'd give it a good blast. I took the hatchet from my toolbox and gave my hammer to Jake. This set little Frank into a tizzy, as he was the only one left without a weapon. I gave him the plastic baseball bat and told him to be careful, with a wink. If he were forced to use the ridiculous thing in defense, the rest of us would likely be dead anyway. Something about the way the tendrils had left rattled my bones. I knew they could have broken through those windows. They could have easily reached into our home and constricted all of us to death. Why didn't they? The motivations of the entity or entities that had spawned forth those grotesque, slimy limbs were lost on me, to be sure. I can't say I know what exactly drove them, but I surely had a pulse on what they wanted. So again, why didn't they come and get it? I stepped up behind my wife sitting in the kitchen and began rubbing her shoulders. She closed her eyes and leaned into my thumbs. Courtney's hair was frizzy as ever, standing out in wild directions. I'd only ever seen it that way a handful of times. Once was when we'd been caught out in a storm. We'd run home from the nearby trail, having been caught in all the rain. As her hair dried, it popped up in all manner of comical ways. Now, she looked tired. And I knew her hair was that way due to the sweat. I don't think the AC is doing its job, buckaroo. Courtney let out a small noise. That feels nice. I pulled her hair off her neck and blew on the sweat there. What is happening? I asked her, and myself in a whisper. She shrugged. Wish I knew. You know, I never really believed in God, but I've been talking to him an awful lot recently. I know what you mean. I've been thinking about that sort of thing too. You think the boys will be okay? She asked. I think so. They're just a bit shaken up. Aren't we too? I sure am, I said, rounding the table and popping a squat across from her. Thanks for keeping me on my toes earlier. Courtney smiled at me as she pulled her hair into a ponytail, with a band on her wrist. What else am I here for? The lights of the house flickered as it groaned from beneath. It was like a nightclub scene with the flickering of the overhead light. I saw everything in glimpses of frames. Then it was black all around, and I heard the boys screaming from the living room. As the lights came back, I found myself standing. The little brothers had scrambled into the kitchen, clinging to Courtney by her nightgown, both on their knees. I muscled through my own terror and craned my head down to Jake and Frankie. I thought yous twos were supposed to be brave boys. I watched as Jake slid off the floor, holding up his hammer, I am, he said. I just couldn't see nothing. Frankie wasn't going to be coaxed out with any sort of injury to his masculinity, or called a machismo. Turning my attention back to my wife, I said, we should gather the candles. I can't believe I hadn't thought of it earlier, she sighed. I'm just so tired. Me too. You should sleep, I stated. She began to protest, but I followed this up with, we'll have to sleep sometime. We can do it in shifts. I'll take the first one, said Jake, holding the hammer up in his hands. All right, bud, I said. You and me take first watch. I tried to smile, and it felt wrong given the circumstances. But it seemed to swell his chest at least. I glanced at the clock on the stove and shuddered. It blinked 12 o'clock. We'd lost time. Looking over the assortment of candles, canned goods, and array of miscellaneous items thought to possibly be useful soon, was not a reassuring layout. My eyes drifted to the small emergency kit before passing over the rest. We didn't have many supplies, and much of the food was canned veggies and fruits. How long will that last you and your little troop? Not long, I'd wager. I shook this thought and continued rummaging the nooks of our home, hoping to find the one true MacGuffin to save us all. What I found mostly was dust bunnies and spider webs that clung to my skin in translucent tickles. Nothing but insulation in the attic. Nothing but clothes, towels, blankets left in the closets. Courtney slept on the couch while Jake and I took up near the threshold leading from the living room to the kitchen, so that I could keep an eye on her sleeping form and the 7-year-old nestled to her bosom. I sat in the chair a while. Jacob sat at my feet. Jake, the chatterbox, couldn't stop talking, and I had to constantly shush him so that he'd keep his voice to a whisper. You think the lights will go out again? He asked. Wish I knew, buddy. No, I said, holding the single shot between my knees. Do you think they'll be back? I hope not. Me too. He traced his finger along the floor. Aren't you scared? Of course, I said. Sometimes you've got to be brave, though. He nodded and fell deeper into his mesmerizing circling finger. Dad's brave. He is, I said. The kid was right. My brother was possibly the bravest person I'd ever met. Even with all of his other faults, he never was the sort of person to back down from a fight. For a moment, I wish he were there with us in the house. He'd probably know what to do. But instead, it was me. You're brave too, said Jake. I raised an eyebrow. You think so, huh? Sure do. He looked up at me from the floor and directly into my eyes. Thanks, Jake. I mussed his hair and he frowned at me. You're a pretty brave little dude yourself. This planted a sure smile across his little face. Kids are so easy. As the time went on, and I responded to each whim of a question that came from Jake, a sense of normalcy crossed me, and it was calming. Worst of all, it also drooped my eyelids, and I could feel the sleep creep over my brain like fresh weeds. A sharp, mild pain in my knee came, and jerked me awake. I looked down to see Jake, furrowing his brow and brandishing the hammer. "I know you're tired, but it's our watch, not mine. Listen here, you little shit." But he was right, and I couldn't help but to chuckle at his disappointed expression. He looked like his father at that moment. That's the very second the scratching started at the back door, near the kitchen counter. I looked to the door, as did Jake. Then the boy turned back to look at me, and an unmistakable, abject terror radiated straight from his eyes and through my body. I stepped up from my chair and angled the gun's barrel at the back door, listening as hard as I could at the sound of the thing clawing at the base of the other side of that entryway. It sounded small, and it reminded me of a rodent clawing into a wall to make a nest. I neared the door cautiously. Jake and I listened to the unknown creature on the other side as it marred away with its claws. That's when the small sounds of an animalistic whine followed. The clawing stopped and we waited, never taking our eyes off that door. An unmistakable guttural growl could be heard, and the sick sensation in the pit of my stomach grew ever more. I knew what was on the other side of that door, didn't I? "Jake." He jumped at the sound of his own name. "Be careful. I'm going to open the door. I need you to be brave, all right?" "Okay," he said. His voice was small and far away. I felt for him, but I needed him to keep his wits about him if I intended to pull this off. "If anything bad comes through there, you focus on shutting the door." He nodded. I closed the space between me and the door, unlocking it and swinging it open before my nerves could stop me. I was immediately met by a black and never-ending abyss, going on in the distance forever. As the door came in, so did the small whining critter that had been clawing at the door. A dog. A mutt, really. With spotted white and black fur, slid along the kitchen floor with a clatter, and slammed into the threshold leading to the living room. Poor thing must be terrified. He disappeared somewhere around the corner, and I focused on the black air out there. I couldn't see a thing, and yet something was drawing me out to explore what it was. The most basic weakness in all human nature was springing forth like a chain on end, tugging me away to the unknown. I investigated the blackness out there, and could feel the call of the wild, the call of something I'd only ever dreamt of. It was all of creation that must be out there, in that empty nothingness. I felt little and bold all at once. Jake slammed the door shut and I blinked, turned to look at the boy as he locked it. I rubbed my temples and smiled at him. There's something out there. It's more than just those tentacles. It's more than just those yellow-eyed watchers. God is out there. I locked the door back as Jake skittered to find where the dog had run. I could hear the sound of my wife waking up and stretching, as well as little Frankie saying, "Get off, quit licking my face." Courtney entered the kitchen, putting a hand over her wide O mouth, and the dog followed, looking up at us out of the side of his white eyes, tail tucked. As I hunkered down to give him a scratch behind the ear, the little fellow flinched. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you." I reached out again slowly, and began rubbing the fur around the side of his face. He leaned into it, and his back end began to shake to and fro. "We have a dog now?" asked Courtney. "It's probably the least strange thing to happen since yesterday," I responded, looking up from the dog to her. "I guess he can't stay out there with those," she shuddered, "things." "Yeah, he came to the door and I couldn't leave him. Poor thing must have been terrified out there all alone." He looked up into my face as if to say, "You've got that right, buckaroo." She nodded, as if to affirm this, and Jake stepped into the kitchen from the hall. "There he is," said Jake with a smile, shifting over to pet the dog. "What's his name?" "Well, he's got no collar," I said, taking up in a chair. "I guess that means you guys get to name him." For a second, I swear I saw a glimmer of a smile flash over Courtney's face as she poured the old coffee grounds into the trash can. "Steve," said Jake, looking into the calming, sad eyes of the mutt. "Steve's a man's name," I said. "Yep," said Jake. I shrugged. We were caught amid a dream, and still my nephew found a way to make a situation feel normal. "All right, then." The foundation shook beneath our feet once more, and we were left in the dark, scrambling for our gathered candles, with Steve barking at every motion we made. As the house was lit in the yellow glow of the small flames, a sense of security fell over us as we sat in the kitchen together. Still, I could not shake the feeling I'd been overcome with when I stared out into that night's air. It ran through my blood and made it difficult to breathe. "What's out there?" asked Courtney, peering through the cracks between the wooden slats secured before the window above the sink. She reached up on her tiptoes and squinted into a sliver. I can almost see nothing. I moved to her and leaned in as well. My nephews pet the trembling Steve on the floor. As I looked out through the crack she did, I saw those same yellow eyes. But this time they were much closer than they had been when I'd seen them out in the forest. Now they were no more than 30 yards away from the house. Fuck that. I felt ice run through the length of my spine. "You see the eyes?" I asked my wife. She nodded. "Is that what you were talking about?" "Yup." I let the end of the word pop. The yellow eyes moved in a circular motion outside our home, like cult members around a bonfire. A small whimper came from my wife, and I turned to look at the tears rolling down her face. "Why?" she sobbed. "Why is this happening? I just don't understand." I reached out and touched her shoulder, but she flinched in much the same way that Steve had when I'd initially tried to pet him. "It's going to be all right, hon." No, it's not." She covered her mouth, choosing to stand in front of the stove and study the curled eyes atop it. I did the thing I almost always do in a moment of distress. I lashed out. "Fuck this," I hissed under my breath, and stomped to snatch the single shot lying across the kitchen table. I clicked the safety off and went to the back door, unlocking it, swinging it in. I pointed the barrel of the gun into the eternal night. Taking aim, I kept a pair of those glowing eyes in my sight as it moved across the edge of our back lawn. I squeezed the trigger and almost buckled under the weight of the recoil against my shoulder. I had missed the glowing-eyed figure out there as its trajectory did not change even momentarily. The flash of the gun briefly illuminated the immediate area, and I was in awe. I turned to look at Courtney with an expression I hoped would convey my absolute terror. "Give me a candle, quickly!" I handed the shotgun off to Courtney, and she attempted to reload it with her shaky, slender fingers. I took the lit candle and knelt near the edge of the open doorway. It was black, absolutely, and as I neared the candle to it, still, the ground there did not reflect any light. Because there's no ground there. I held the candle out of my right hand and tried to press my left hand out into what should have been our back porch. But instead there was only open air. Without warning, I was struck with vertigo, and I grew dizzy, dropping the candle. Courtney reached out to grab my shoulder, and I watched in a haze as the candle fell and fell and fell until its light was swallowed up. I didn't hear it strike anything before it disappeared. As the nausea subsided, I realized I was gripping onto the edge of the doorway, so that the veins there stood out. I slammed the door shut and flexed them. "There's no ground!" I shouted. I looked at Courtney with her shoulders bobbing up and down as she held her hands in front of her face. The sobbing erupted from her furiously. With haste, I moved through the kitchen, towards the front of the house, into the living room to the front door. I swung it open, squinting while looking down into infinite shadows beneath. I grabbed hold of the door trim with my right hand and swung my left foot out, hoping that it would touch the front porch. But my leg merely dangled into the open air. Somehow our home had been transported and suspended into some alternate reality. Or it had been lifted into space. Or it was limbo. Or hell. Or I don't know. I shut the door. Where are we? I returned and opened the dark fridge, pulling a beer from the crisper drawer, and sitting in the floor against the cabinets beneath the sink. I cracked it open, slurped down the foam, lit a cigarette, and chuckled to myself. If only to keep the madness away. Lil Frank came over to sit with me, placing a hand on my leg. "It's okay, Uncle Derek." His face was calm, and his reassuring grin felt warm, sincere. It broke my heart to say what I said next, but it came out of my mouth all the same. "No, kid. No, it's not."
Chronicler here. We here at Creepy Spaghet would like to thank EdwardTheCrazyMan for allowing us to tell their story. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to stay updated on these terrible tales, and make sure to check out the author in the links below. If you're interested in having your story narrated, be sure to reach out to our humble overseer, as he continues his journey to pull the darkest stories from the infinite depths of the internet. Until next time, fiends. And remember, we are darkness.